You're watching a new edition of World Insight with me, James Chow. As always, each weekend we bring you a half-hour program, and within these 30 minutes we're going to give you analysis on all the stories in the headlines. Let's get started now with our first report today. Now, of course, the big headline this week is Copenhagen, where the climate change conference continues as we speak. At issue are the next 2 weeks when both industrialized and developing nations can agree to collectively cut emissions far enough to avert the worst consequences of global warming. But the real work in Copenhagen will happen behind closed doors. That's where the negotiators will be trying to resolve the three biggest problems in this debate: targets, money and responsibility.
This is Tuvalu, one of the smallest and lowest nations in the world. This group of islands in the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and Australia is home to about 10,000 people. But one of these days, Tuvalu might only exist on an outdated map.
If Tuvalu has to be washed away from the face of the earth, I have to go. But I don't want to go.
Tuvaluans have already suffered from rising sea levels. In 50 years, nearly 60% of the country will be submerged, and nothing will be left on the sea surface when the tide rises. Tuvalu is on its way to being the first nation to disappear due to climate change, but it won't be the last. A new study warns that by the year 2100, global sea levels could rise between 75 to 190 centimeters.
This is our chance. If we miss this one, it could take years before we get a new and better one, if we ever did.
The sense of urgency characterizes the UN climate conference in Copenhagen this week. The summit is the largest on climate in history, with diplomats from 192 nations attending. It is also the most important one, with about 110 heads of state and government participating. The final target is a new global climate treaty, as the 1997 Kyoto Protocol is due to expire in 2012. But standing in the way are disputes between developing countries and developed nations. The Kyoto Protocol recognizes that nations have common but differentiated responsibilities to cut emissions. 37 wealthy nations need to cut emissions an average 5% below 1990 levels by 2012. Developing economies are allowed to reduce emissions voluntarily. But rich nations led by Denmark are trying to set the agenda at Copenhagen and impose their own terms on the developing world. Developing countries such as China and India have said that the basic principle of the Kyoto Protocol should not be changed in any new deal.
Although all of us are affected by climate change, the historic accumulation of CO2 is not as a result of anything that we have done.
The Industrial Revolution, which started in the West, brought a massive growth in energy consumption. By 1950, developed countries had produced 95% of the total global CO2. And from 1950 to 2000, they accounted for 77%. Even today, rich nations emit 50% of the greenhouse gases, with only 22% of the world's population.
Developed countries should be providing financial support to developing countries, and this should not be charity work. This is because, as the creators of the problem, they should fulfill their legal obligations.
But how many billions of dollars will it cost, and who will pay the bill? The United Nations has suggested that $10 billion is required every year for the next 3 years. But that's not enough.
And let me just actually be very blunt. $10 billion will not buy developing countries' people enough coffins.
Africa, poor women in Africa who have been affected. 1 degree. 1 degree.
Rich nations try to get rid of their responsibilities because they don't want to sacrifice their trade and jobs. So they, on the one hand, pressure developing countries such as India and China to do more, and on the other hand, are reluctant to provide money and technologies to poor nations. What's more, energy consumption through fossil fuel is related to the speed and scale of economic development. In the name of climate change, rich nations try to squeeze the development space for rising economies in order to ensure that their own status is not threatened.
But climate change is about politics as much as economics. In Britain, thousands of demonstrators circled the Houses of Parliament days before the Copenhagen summit.
We need Gordon Brown to act now and everybody else to act now, not talk, act now.
In fact, across Europe, the tide of public opinion runs high. The European Union is leading the world in the campaign to curb climate change, and its leaders are under public pressure to do more. In the streets of Copenhagen, digitally altered images of some EU leaders in the year 2020 carry a grim prediction. But unlike Europeans, Americans don't seem that interested in global warming. A recently released GlobeScan survey of 23 countries shows that 45% of Americans say climate change is very serious. The average figure is 63%.
Public transportation around here would have to come a long way before I could give up my car.
For a country on wheels, changing lifestyles for the sake of climate change seems difficult. The Obama administration has offered to reduce U.S. emissions by 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. But the pledge needs Senate approval. 8 years ago, George Bush withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. This week, the U.S. president heads to Oslo to receive his Nobel Prize and, by the way, to attend the climate conference next week.
The US has been dragging its feet on curbing climate change. Now, whether the US can show some leadership and take its share of responsibility on this topic is crucial to a positive and fair outcome of the meetings. Being the world's only superpower and the biggest emitter of the past 100 years, America's image of a global leader is facing a great test at the Copenhagen summit.
But as politicians debate over which country should take more responsibility, time is running out. 2 days before the summit started, an ice sculpture of a polar bear was unveiled in the Danish capital. The ice is melting, revealing a symbolic skeleton inside the sculpture. But in fact, in the Arctic, it's not just the bears that are in danger. Because of melting sea ice, polar bears are forced to move more frequently to land. There, they fight with human beings for resources.
Most of all, I hope that when you leave this conference hall, you will leave the planet safer and greener for the future. So please help us to turn Copenhagen into Hopenhagen. Please seal the deal.
That may best explain why Copenhagen must be Hopenhagen. When we cope, there is hope.